Why is she wearing that ring? The little girl's voice cut through the hush of the cathedral like ice. Jonathan Carlyle froze mid-step, the polished oak altar gleaming under the afternoon sun, as his fingers hovered over the sapphire blue band he was about to place on Vanessa Sinclair's hand. Guests stopped clapping, their champagne flutes trembling in midair. The sapphire sparkled unnaturally, reflecting the stained glass windows, and Vanessa's smile stiffened, her eyes darting for reassurance from the officiant who waved a hand dismissively, murmuring that the girl must be mistaken. Naomi Brooks stepped closer, her small dark hands clutching a crumpled old photograph, her voice firm and low. "I've seen this ring before, in my mother's pictures." The air thickened. Jonathan's throat tightened as the room seemed to constrict around the truth hanging between them. 3 hours earlier, the sun had barely risen over Manhattan, and the faint scent of vanilla and eucalyptus lingered from the florist's arrangements, mixing with the wax polish of the pews. A forgotten envelope sat on the side table near the bridal suite. The wax seal cracked slightly, unnoticed by anyone but Naomi. She had spotted it first while slipping past the crowd, eyes sharp, hands steady, like she always did with small details adults overlooked. Every guest moved as if in slow motion, unaware that the slightest shift of that envelope, the tilt of a ring, or the flicker of a shadow could unravel decades of carefully curated appearances. Naomi did not cry. She tilted her head, pointing at the sapphire and whispering, "It belonged to someone who isn't here anymore." Jonathan's gaze flicked to Vanessa, who blinked too quickly, a faint sweat forming at her temple, lips tightening around an uneasy smile. The choir's soft hymn continued, yet the notes felt jagged, echoing against the marble like a warning. Naomi's other hand rested on the photograph, the edges frayed, showing Eleanor Carlyle holding that same ring in a gala long before Vanessa was ever part of this world. The officiant cleared his throat, but Jonathan didn't move. He noticed for the first time a tiny nick on the ring's side, catching the sunlight in a way he didn't remember. He leaned closer, heart hammering, as if that minute detail whispered the beginning of a story no one else was ready to hear. Vanessa's hand trembled slightly. She tried to cover the ring with the folds of her veil, but Jonathan's eyes were drawn to it anyway, and in that instant, the cathedral seemed to pause. Naomi's voice, low and unwavering, sliced through the tension again. "Ask her about the blue ring." For a heartbeat, everything went silent. The clinking of silverware at the reception hall downstairs, the flutter of candle flames in nearby sconces, the soft rustle of silk from the bridesmaids' gowns. All of it faded into a single, sharp point of focus. That sapphire, that photograph, and the little girl who saw more than anyone in the room thought possible. Jonathan's eyes didn't move from the sapphire as the choir's soft hum filled the cathedral, but the weight of suspicion was settling like a slow fog in his chest. Naomi's small hands gripped the crumpled photograph a little tighter, the edges frayed from years of handling, and she glanced quickly at Vanessa, who now adjusted the veil over her wrist as if hiding something more than just her hand. The officiant whispered directions to the organist, a normal gesture, yet the slight twitch in his fingers as he turned the pages of sheet music caught Jonathan's attention. It was too deliberate, too precise, as if someone wanted nothing to be noticed. Naomi whispered. She smiled too fast, pointing subtly at Vanessa's lips, her voice barely audible over the echoing notes. Jonathan's stomach nodded as he noticed a faint trace of vanilla perfume lingering on Vanessa's coat, layered over another scent he couldn't place. Something faintly metallic, like the tang of polished brass, almost as if the air itself carried a hidden message. A page in the bridal program was slightly creased, the fold not aligning with the rest, an overlooked detail by the wedding planner who straightened it with a distracted hand. Naomi bent low, peering at the crease, then back at Jonathan, and whispered again, "The crease isn't random. It matches the corner of a photo from my mother's album." He exhaled slowly, noting the tiny nick in the ring glinting under the candlelight. Yet he said nothing, merely observing, storing every micro-detail in the recesses of his mind. Vanessa's fingers drummed lightly against her champagne flute, a polite rhythm, but Jonathan noticed the pause between beats, just enough to suggest hesitation, concealment, or calculation. Naomi slid the old photograph across the polished pew, her eyes locking briefly with Jonathan's, ensuring he saw the faint timestamp scribbled on the corner. Years before Vanessa had met him, yet she now wore the same sapphire. He raised a quiet brow, leaning slightly to see better, and the officiant murmured reassurance, unaware of the undercurrent of tension Naomi had unleashed. A soft ping came from a phone left on a side table, the sound swallowed immediately by the cathedral's acoustics, but Naomi caught it, nodding minutely toward the display, recognizing a deleted voicemail notification she had seen her mother handle once. Jonathan's breath caught. The scent, the crease, the ping, the timing, all insignificant alone, but woven together they whispered an unsettling pattern. Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line as she added softly, "She wasn't supposed to have it," her voice carrying the weight of knowledge far beyond her 11 years, and Jonathan's gaze sharpened, the pale light catching the edge of the ring where the nick almost looked like a calligraphy mark. Every adult around maintained calm, masks of civility firmly in place, yet a subtle shift in Vanessa's posture, the tilt of her shoulder, the catch in her throat, hinted at an imperfection in the story they were trying to tell. Jonathan noted it, silent, recording in his mind the alignment of scents, creases, and gestures. Outside, faint rain tapped against stained glass, a whispering percussion that made Naomi's words echo in his head. She wasn't supposed to have it, and for the first time, Jonathan realized the unease wasn't a feeling. It was proof. Jonathan slipped the photograph into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket without another word, but Naomi noticed the way his fingers lingered against the paper for half a second. Too long. The cathedral lights reflected softly against the marble floor as guests resumed whispering in low, careful voices, pretending the ceremony had not just cracked open in front of them. Vanessa smiled again, elegant and practiced, one manicured hand resting lightly over the sapphire ring, as if calming herself instead of hiding it. "She's a child," she said gently to the guests nearest the altar. "Children misunderstand things all the time." Her voice sounded warm enough to soothe the room, yet Naomi watched the way she avoided looking directly at the photograph now hidden in Jonathan's pocket. That mattered more than the words. Naomi stepped closer to the first pew, her worn sneakers silent against the polished floor. "My mother didn't misunderstand," she said quietly. Jonathan looked down at her then, really looked at her for the first time since she spoke. Her coat sleeves were too short for her wrists, and the zipper had been repaired with a small silver paperclip bent into place. But her eyes stayed steady. Not angry, not dramatic, just certain. The officiant cleared his throat again and suggested a short recess before continuing the ceremony. Vanessa nodded too quickly. "That's probably best," she said, reaching lightly for Jonathan's arm. He let her touch him, but Naomi noticed something strange immediately. Vanessa's thumb brushed twice against the sleeve of his tuxedo near the inside pocket where the photograph rested. Not affection. Checking. Jonathan seemed to notice it too because his eyes lowered briefly to her hand before lifting again. "How did your mother know Eleanor?" he asked Naomi calmly. Vanessa's shoulders tightened almost invisibly beneath the silk of her gown. Naomi hesitated only once. "She worked for her." Vanessa laughed softly before the silence could settle. "Jonathan, Eleanor had dozens of assistants over the years." Her tone remained pleasant, but she took one careful step closer to Naomi now, enough to cast a shadow over the girl's shoes. "Sweetheart, people sometimes keep old photos and imagine connections that aren't really there." Naomi did not step back. "My mother kept receipts," she answered. Jonathan's expression shifted slightly, not belief, but attention. Naomi slowly reached into her coat pocket again, and for the first time Vanessa lost control of her smile completely. It vanished for less than a second, then came back thinner. Naomi unfolded a faded pharmacy receipt, the paper so worn at the folds it looked ready to tear apart. Jonathan accepted it carefully. The receipt was dated 11 days before Eleanor Carlisle's fatal car accident. At the bottom was a handwritten note in blue ink, "Picked up for VS." Jonathan's eyes stopped there. VS Vanessa Sinclair quickly answered before he even asked. That could mean anyone, but her voice had changed. Still soft, just tighter now. Jonathan turned the receipt over. On the back, barely visible under the cathedral lights, was another note written in hurried handwriting. Tell Eleanor not to take the pills if Vanessa brings them herself. The choir had stopped practicing sometime during the last minute, and now the cathedral felt unnaturally quiet. Somewhere deeper inside the building, a spoon clinked against china from the reception kitchen below. Naomi swallowed hard but kept speaking anyway. My mom said Eleanor stopped trusting somebody near the end, she whispered. Jonathan read the note again slowly, his thumb pressing against the faded ink. Vanessa reached toward the receipt suddenly, almost instinctively. This is insane, she said, still smiling for the guests watching nearby. Jonathan, somebody is manipulating this little girl. But Jonathan did not hand the paper back. He only looked at Vanessa carefully now, as though comparing her voice to a memory he could not fully reach yet. Then Naomi spoke one more time, and this time her voice made the air in the cathedral feel cold. My mother hid that receipt inside the frame of Eleanor's wedding picture, she said softly. She said if anybody ever tried to wear the blue ring again, it meant they thought Eleanor could never speak back. The silence after Naomi's last sentence did not break all at once. Cracked slowly, like ice under too much weight. Jonathan kept holding the faded pharmacy receipt between two fingers while the guests near the altar avoided looking directly at him. Vanessa inhaled carefully, recovering first. Jonathan, she said softly, stepping closer with the calm voice people used around hospitals and funerals. This has gone far enough. Her hand touched his sleeve again, but this time he noticed she never touched the receipt itself. Not once. A tall man in a charcoal gray suit appeared quietly near the front pews. Martin Hale, Jonathan's attorney for nearly 12 years. Expensive watch. Silver tie clip. Expression perfectly neutral. Mr. Carlyle, he said gently, perhaps we should continue this discussion privately. The wording sounded reasonable, respectful. But Naomi noticed the way Martin positioned himself slightly between her and Jonathan, blocking her from view without ever making it obvious. The cathedral suddenly felt enormous around her. Marble columns, crystal chandeliers, men with earpieces near the exits, women in silk gowns whispering behind gloved hands. Naomi's sneakers squeaked faintly against the polished floor when she shifted her weight. She looked smaller now. Smaller than the flower arrangements, smaller than the gold-framed portraits near the vestibule. But she did not lower her eyes. I'm not lying, she said quietly. Martin offered a patient smile adults used when they already decided a child was inconvenient. No one said you were, sweetheart. Naomi hated sweetheart immediately. Jonathan glanced at her. She could tell he heard it too. Martin continued smoothly. But memories become complicated after grief, especially for children. Vanessa nodded with visible relief. Exactly. Her voice warmed again as she turned toward several guests watching nervously nearby. This poor girl lost her mother recently. Someone probably filled her head with stories. Naomi gripped the photograph harder. The edge of the paper pressed sharply into her palm. My mother didn't tell stories, she whispered. Martin crouched slightly to appear less intimidating, though the movement somehow made him feel colder. Naomi, he said kindly, where is this photo album now? There it was. Not concern. Location. Naomi noticed Jonathan notice it too. Martin asked about the album before asking about her mother, before asking where she lived, before asking if she was okay. Naomi answered carefully. Safe. Vanessa's jaw tightened for less than a second. Martin smiled again. Of course. Somewhere downstairs, reception staff rolled silver carts across tile floors. The faint clinking of champagne glasses drifted upward through the cathedral vents. Normal sounds. Wedding sounds. But up here near the altar, every word felt sharpened. Jonathan finally spoke. How did Naomi get into the ceremony? One of the security men answered immediately. She came in with catering staff, sir. Naomi looked down at her sleeves. My grandma works in the kitchen, she said. Vanessa gave a sympathetic sigh that sounded almost perfect. Jonathan, this is exactly why security procedures exist. Not cruel. Just clean. controlled. Naomi felt the room slowly deciding what she was. A mistake that wandered too far into wealth. Martin extended his hand toward the photograph gently. "May I see it for a moment?" Naomi hesitated. Jonathan watched that hesitation carefully. "You don't have to hand it over," he said quietly. Vanessa looked at him immediately, too quickly. Then she smiled again. Nobody is trying to take anything from her. But Naomi saw it then. Tiny. Fast. Vanessa's eyes flicked not toward the photograph, but toward the inside pocket of Jonathan's tuxedo where the receipt rested. Fear. Real fear this time. Jonathan must have seen it too because his expression changed almost invisibly. Not belief yet, but calculation. Martin straightened and adjusted his cufflinks. "Mr. Carlyle," he said calmly, "there's no reason to disrupt your wedding over an old receipt and a frightened child." Jonathan's thumb rubbed once against the folded paper in his pocket. Then Naomi spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "If it's meaningless," she asked softly, "why did she try to burn the original?" The cathedral went still. Vanessa's face lost color. And for the first time since Naomi arrived, Martin Hale stopped smiling. No one spoke for several seconds after Naomi's question. Even the reception noise drifting up from below seemed farther away now, muted beneath the heavy silence wrapped. Around the altar, Vanessa recovered first. "That's absurd," she said softly, though her voice no longer carried the effortless warmth it had earlier. "Jonathan, this child is repeating things she doesn't understand." But Jonathan noticed she did not ask what original Naomi meant. She already knew. Naomi slowly lowered her hand into the inside pocket of her coat again. This time she did not pull out a photograph or a receipt. She pulled out an old silver flip phone with scratches running across the casing and a cracked corner held together with clear tape. The cathedral lights reflected dimly against the worn screen. "My mother hid things inside here," Naomi whispered. Martin Hale stepped forward immediately. "Mr. Carlyle, I strongly advise against encouraging this." Jonathan ignored him. His eyes stayed fixed on the phone. Something about it hit him strangely hard. Eleanor used to carry the same model years ago before smartphones replaced everything. Vanessa folded her arms now, elegant but tighter than before. "Anybody can buy an old phone online." Naomi opened the device carefully, almost reverently. "Not with this inside." Her thumb pressed a button and the screen flickered weakly to life. Battery low. One voicemail saved. Jonathan felt his stomach tighten unexpectedly. Just one. Naomi held the phone protectively against her chest before looking directly at Jonathan. "My mom said never to let anybody else hear it first." Martin's jaw shifted slightly. Vanessa looked away for the first time since the confrontation began, her eyes drifting toward the side exit near the choir room. Jonathan noticed that too. "Play it," he said quietly. Naomi hesitated. "If I do, she'll know my mom kept it." Vanessa laughed softly again, but the sound came too fast now, too brittle. "Jonathan, this is becoming cruel. Eleanor died 8 years ago. We are standing in the middle of our wedding while a frightened little girl digs through old grief for attention." Naomi's fingers tightened around the phone. "My mother was scared all the time near the end," she whispered. Jonathan looked at her sharply. "Near the end of what?" Naomi swallowed once. "Near the end of Eleanor being alive." Martin stepped closer again, voice calm and professional. "This has crossed a line." But Jonathan held out his hand toward Naomi instead. Slowly, carefully, not demanding. Naomi studied him for a long moment before placing the old flip phone into his palm. Felt lighter than he expected. Jonathan stared at the tiny blinking voicemail icon. Saved. 1. Timestamp. 11:42 p.m. August 14th. The night before Eleanor's accident. Jonathan stopped breathing for half a second. He remembered that date because Eleanor had called him 3 times that night while he was in Chicago closing a merger deal. He never answered. Vanessa spoke quietly beside him. "You don't owe this nonsense your attention." Jonathan pressed play anyway. Static crackled through the cathedral speakers softly because the phone volume had been turned all the way up years ago. Then came Eleanor's voice, thin, nervous, breathing unevenly. "If anything happens to me." The recording cut abruptly for 2 seconds before returning. "Vanessa already knows about the ring." Jonathan's fingers tightened around the phone so hard the plastic creaked. Eleanor continued in a whisper, "I made copies of everything. If she finds them first, she'll destroy all of it." Another burst of static followed. Then a man's voice appeared faintly in the background. Jonathan frowned instantly. Familiar. Very familiar. The voicemail ended before the man finished speaking, but Jonathan's face changed anyway, slowly, coldly, because the voice behind Eleanor in the recording did not belong to a stranger. It belonged to Martin Hale. Jonathan did not look at Martin Hale immediately after the voicemail ended. That was the part that frightened Martin most. The attorney stood near the altar with both hands loosely folded in front of him, still calm enough for anyone else in the cathedral to believe nothing serious had happened. Vanessa lowered her gaze toward the marble floor, one hand resting against the sapphire ring, as if touching it could steady her breathing. But Jonathan only stared at the old flip phone in his hand, replaying the last few seconds of Eleanor's voice silently inside his head. The static, the fear in her breathing, and Martin's voice behind her, familiar enough that Jonathan recognized it instantly even through distortion. Somewhere below the cathedral, a dishwasher started running in the reception kitchen, the mechanical hum vibrating faintly through the floor beneath their feet. Ordinary sound. Ordinary wedding noise. It made the silence near the altar feel even colder. Jonathan closed the phone carefully and handed it back to Naomi. "Keep this with you," he said quietly. Naomi nodded immediately and slipped the phone back inside her coat. She never once asked how much it might be worth. She never asked for money. She only asked one thing. "Don't let them say my mother lied." Jonathan looked at her for a long moment after that. Then he reached into his tuxedo pocket and removed his own phone. "Excuse me for a moment," he said calmly to the room. Vanessa stepped toward him instantly. "Jonathan, please," she whispered softly enough for the guests not to hear. "This is grief and confusion mixed together." Eleanor was paranoid near the end. Jonathan finally looked directly at her again. "Near the end of what?" he asked quietly. Vanessa opened her mouth too fast. "Near the end of her marriage." Wrong answer. Jonathan saw it immediately because Eleanor had still been legally married to him when she died. Vanessa corrected herself almost instantly, but the damage was already there. "I mean, before the accident." Jonathan gave the smallest nod, as if accepting the explanation. But inside, something had shifted permanently. He walked away from the altar without another word and stopped near one of the side corridors beside the choir room. Rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows overhead while he dialed a private number from memory. "David," he said when the line connected. "I need you to access the archive security files from Lakewood Estate, August 14th through 16th. Especially garage footage." A pause. "No, don't notify anyone yet." Jonathan lowered his voice further. "And pull every visitor log connected to Eleanor's medical records before the accident." He ended the call before questions could begin. Behind him, reception staff moved silver trays through the hallway while guests pretended not to stare. Jonathan remained perfectly composed on the outside. Billionaires learned that early. Never react before you understand the board completely. But now his mind kept replaying details he had ignored for years. Eleanor changing her passwords 3 weeks before she died. Eleanor asking if Martin Hale had access to trust documents he should not have seen yet. Eleanor suddenly refusing medication prescribed after her anxiety diagnosis. At the time, Jonathan thought grief and stress had made her suspicious. Now he wasn't sure anymore. Naomi stood quietly near the back pews while a catering employee wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders. She thanked the woman politely and immediately folded the blanket smaller so it wouldn't drag on the floor. Jonathan noticed that too. Small habits, careful habits, the habits of a child raised around adults who lost things easily. Martin approached him near the corridor entrance with measured calm. "Jonathan," he said carefully, "whatever Eleanor believed back then, It does not justify humiliating Vanessa publicly over fragmented evidence. Jonathan adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo slowly. Did you know Eleanor was making copies of documents before she died? Martin hesitated. Tiny. Less than a second. But Jonathan saw it.
No, Martin answered smoothly.
Jonathan nodded once. Interesting. Then his phone vibrated softly in his hand. A message from David appeared on the screen. Lakewood Security Archive. 7 minutes missing. Deleted manually. Jonathan stared at the message while cold realization settled into his chest with terrifying clarity. Only 3 people had administrator access capable of deleting footage at Lakewood Estate 8 years ago. Eleanor.
Martin Hale.
And Vanessa Sinclair. Jonathan held the phone from Naomi lightly in one hand while his other hand rested near the marble railing of the cathedral balcony, his eyes narrowing subtly at Vanessa Sinclair across the room. The sapphire ring caught the overhead lights, gleaming almost defiantly, while Vanessa's fingers fidgeted against it, brushing against the folds of her gown in a rhythm too calculated to be. Unconscious, Naomi stepped closer, her small frame carefully avoiding the shiny brass plaques embedded along the aisle, and whispered, "Remember the way she held the keys last week?" Jonathan's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He had memorized those gestures. The way Vanessa held her office keys in her left hand, subtly different from how anyone else in the building ever touched them. Micro-details that would seem trivial to anyone else. He nodded once to Naomi. "Show me." She pointed across the room. Vanessa had been speaking quietly to Martin Hale, her tone smooth and unbroken, but Jonathan noticed the slight tilt of her shoulder when she laughed, the almost imperceptible pause between syllables, a hesitation he had caught before on security footage months ago. He kept his voice low. "Repeat exactly what you just told him," he said, almost casually. Vanessa blinked, her eyes flicking to Jonathan, then back at Martin, then slowly repeated her statement, word for word, but Jonathan noticed she changed one tiny detail. The date she mentioned didn't match any known record. Naomi's lips pressed together. She did not correct the date. She simply held the phone slightly higher, tilting it to catch the light on the screen, letting the glow illuminate the crease of the photograph tucked inside. The cathedral felt colder now. Somewhere, a spoon clinked faintly against a glass in the reception kitchen far below, a mundane sound that seemed to stretch out the tension like elastic. Jonathan leaned slightly, noting the soft flicker of the recording light on the phone and the way Vanessa's gaze shifted to the ceiling for the briefest fraction of a second, as if calculating what to do next. He did not flinch, did not speak louder, but allowed a silence to stretch long enough for her to feel it pressing against her chest. Naomi stepped a bit closer, eyes sharp, and whispered, "She said my mother could trust no one after midnight." Jonathan's lips barely moved. "Show me the clock on her desk. Right now." Vanessa's hand twitched almost imperceptibly toward a bracelet she always wore. She froze, realizing Jonathan had noticed the pattern, the time she left her office every night. Before Eleanor's accident. Martin Hale shifted his weight, clearing his throat, but Jonathan didn't look at him. He only watched Vanessa, eyes cold and precise. A faint light from a nearby security camera flickered above the balcony, casting a tiny red that reflected off the marble floor. Naomi held her stance, her small hand tightening on the folded photograph. Vanessa's posture straightened, the practiced grace slipping slightly. Jonathan raised a finger toward the phone. "Play it again," he said quietly. Naomi obeyed, pressing the button. Eleanor's voice filled the quiet air once more, delicate and frightened, layered over the faint hum of the cathedral's ventilation. Jonathan noticed Vanessa's eyes widen just enough to reveal the first crack in her mask. A micro-reaction she didn't catch herself. Naomi whispered. She knew the ring wasn't hers. Jonathan's hand tightened imperceptibly around the phone. He glanced at Vanessa, then at Martin. For the first time, both realized Naomi was no longer alone in this, and Jonathan had already begun to control the board. The red recording light above the cathedral balcony blinked steadily, small and quiet, while nobody beneath it seemed willing to breathe too loudly anymore. Jonathan stood motionless near the altar steps, one hand holding Naomi's old flip phone, the other resting loosely at his side. Vanessa's posture remained graceful from a distance, but close enough now. He could see the tension pulling at the corners of her mouth every time Eleanor's voice replayed through the tiny speaker. Martin Hale had stopped pretending to smile entirely. Naomi noticed that first. Adults always thought children watched faces, but Naomi watched hands. Martin's right hand kept brushing the inside pocket of his jacket every few seconds, checking something hidden there. Jonathan noticed too. "Take your hand out of your pocket, Martin," he said calmly. The entire cathedral seemed to tighten around the sentence. Martin obeyed slowly. A white envelope appeared between his fingers before he could stop himself. Jonathan's eyes lowered toward it immediately. "What is that?" Martin's voice stayed level. "Private documents." Naomi spoke softly before Jonathan could answer. "It's thick because there are photographs inside." Martin looked at her sharply for the first time all afternoon. Not annoyance anymore. Fear. Jonathan held out his hand. "Give it to me." Vanessa stepped forward instantly. "Jonathan, enough." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. "You're letting a child destroy everything because of old grief and half-truths." Jonathan accepted the envelope from Martin without looking away from Vanessa. Then he opened it carefully. The first thing he saw was Eleanor. Alive. Standing beside Lakewood Estates' garage entrance 2 nights before the accident. The timestamp glowed clearly in the corner. August 14th, 11:37 p.m. Jonathan's chest tightened painfully because Eleanor was wearing the blue sapphire ring in the photo. Vanessa had told him for 8 years that the ring disappeared after the crash. Naomi pointed quietly toward the second photograph underneath. "That one." Jonathan lifted it slowly. This time the image showed Vanessa entering the garage 6 minutes later. Same timestamp sequence. Same night. Same coat she claimed she had never owned before meeting him. Jonathan's face lost color little by little as the truth began fitting together with horrifying precision. Missing security footage. Deleted files. The voicemail. Eleanor's fear. Vanessa folded her arms tightly now. Those photos proved nothing. But her voice had gone thin. Jonathan turned over the second photograph. On the back was Eleanor's handwriting. He recognized it instantly. Elegant. Slanted slightly left whenever she wrote in panic. "If anything happens to me, check Martin's private storage account." Jonathan stopped breathing completely for one terrible second. Martin spoke too quickly. Eleanor wasn't stable near the end. Wrong sentence. Again. Naomi looked toward Jonathan quietly. "My mom said people tell the same lie the same way every time." Jonathan lowered his eyes slowly toward Martin. "You've used that exact phrase 3 times today." Martin's jaw tightened. Vanessa stepped closer to Jonathan now, lowering her voice into something softer, almost intimate. "Please," she whispered. "Not here." Jonathan looked at her for a very long time after that. Then he finally saw it. Not grief, not panic, calculation. She wasn't afraid the wedding was ruined. She was afraid the wrong drawer had been opened. A church employee accidentally bumped the projection controls near the choir rail, and suddenly the large cathedral screen flickered alive behind the altar. David's message thread remained open on Jonathan's phone from earlier. One file had finished uploading. Security archive recovered footage. Jonathan stared at it. 7 deleted minutes restored. Naomi stepped closer beside him, her small fingers tightening around the old flip phone. "That's the part they didn't want anybody to see," she whispered. Jonathan pressed play. Grainy black and white footage filled the cathedral wall. Eleanor appeared first near the garage staircase, visibly upset, clutching papers against her chest. Then Vanessa entered frame. Martin Hale followed 30 seconds later. The entire cathedral went silent. No music. No whispers. No movement. Jonathan watched the woman he almost married standing in recovered footage beside the wife he failed to protect. Eleanor turned toward the camera for one brief moment before the footage froze. Her face looked terrified. Jonathan closed his eyes slowly. When he opened them again, something inside him had changed forever. He placed the photographs carefully on the altar beside the wedding rings, looked toward Martin Hale, and spoke in a voice so calm it made the silence worse. "Call my real attorney." No one moved after Jonathan spoke. The cathedral remained suspended inside a silence so complete that the faint hum of the projector sounded unbearably loud against the marble walls. Vanessa stood near the altar with both hands clasped tightly in front of her now, the sapphire ring still shining beneath the stained glass light like evidence that no longer belonged to her. Martin Hale slowly lowered his eyes toward the recovered footage frozen behind them on the cathedral screen. Eleanor's frightened face remained there for everyone to see. Jonathan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "The wedding is over," he said quietly. The words landed heavier than shouting ever could. Vanessa inhaled sharply. "Jonathan, please." But he stepped back from her before she could touch him again. That movement hurt more than anger. Across the cathedral, several board members from Carlyle Foundation sat motionless in the front pews, their expressions changing as realizations spread through the room piece by piece. Jonathan turned toward them calmly. "Effective immediately," he said. "Martin Hale is suspended from all legal authority connected to Carlyle Foundation, the Eleanor Carlyle Trust, and every estate account under my name." Martin's face finally cracked. "Jonathan, think carefully." "I am," Jonathan answered. Security approached quietly after that. No violence. No scene. Just two men in dark suits standing beside Martin and Vanessa while guests lowered their eyes in uncomfortable silence. Naomi watched everything from near the back pews, still holding the old flip phone against her coat. She did not smile. This was never victory to her. It was something sadder than that. Jonathan looked toward her slowly. "Your mother tried to tell the truth," he said. Naomi swallowed hard once. Nobody listened. The sentence settled into Jonathan's chest like a blade. Because it was true. Eleanor had warned him. Naomi's mother had hidden evidence. And he had spent 8 years protecting the wrong people inside his own name, his own foundation, his own life. Rain continued tapping softly against the stained glass windows while attorneys began quietly escorting guests out of the cathedral. Somewhere downstairs, untouched champagne sat warming on silver trays no one wanted anymore. Jonathan removed the sapphire ring from the altar carefully. He stared at it for several long seconds before walking toward Naomi. The little girl instinctively stepped back half an inch, not out of fear exactly, but habit. The habit of children used to losing things the moment adults noticed them. Jonathan knelt slowly in front of her until they were eye level. "Your mother saved this," he said softly, placing the ring into Naomi's palm. "Not me." Naomi looked down at the sapphire resting against her small dark hand. "It belonged to Eleanor," she whispered. Jonathan nodded once. "And now the truth about her belongs in the open." 3 weeks later, Carlyle Foundation publicly reopened Eleanor Carlyle's case with independent investigators and federal financial auditors reviewing every deleted security archive and sealed legal agreement tied to Martin Hale and Vanessa Sinclair. Multiple trust transfers were frozen. Confidential settlements connected to Naomi's mother were declared unlawful. Her employment records at the foundation were officially restored after being erased for years. Jonathan personally funded legal protection for Naomi and her grandmother, but he never framed it as charity. He called it restitution. Naomi and her grandmother moved into a quiet apartment overlooking Riverside Park, with warm lights in the kitchen and enough groceries that the refrigerator no longer echoed when opened. Jonathan visited only twice that first month. Not because he did not care, but because he was learning something difficult very late in life. Helping people did not mean owning their story. One cold evening near Christmas, Naomi sat at the kitchen table wearing an oversized wool sweater while her grandmother warmed tomato soup on the stove. The old flip phone rested beside a newly framed photograph of Eleanor smiling beneath summer sunlight. Jonathan stood near the doorway holding 2 cups of hot chocolate neither of them had asked for. Naomi looked up at him quietly. "You know what my mom used to say about rich people?" she asked. Jonathan managed a tired smile. "Probably nothing good." Naomi shook her head gently. "She said the dangerous ones weren't the loud ones." Jonathan's smile faded. Naomi wrapped both hands around the warm cup and looked toward Eleanor's restored photograph glowing softly beneath the kitchen light. The dangerous ones, she whispered, were the ones nobody ever questioned. Jonathan stood completely still after that, because for the first time in many years, someone small enough to be ignored had finally told the truth loudly enough to change everything.